Hi, I'm here with my bread recipe. I got all my stuff here ready to go. I've got 3/4 of a tablespoon of yeast. I have pearled yeast, which is the same, it's just a larger grain. A couple of tablespoons of sugar, a cup and a half of the hottest water out of my tap, and then my bread bowl. And I know what you're thinking, my bread bowl looks disgusting, but I don't wash my bread bowl because part of the magic of baking bread is the yeast. And yeast cultures through the air and through time. And so if you could smell, which obviously you can't, but if you could smell my bread bowl, it smells delicious. It's got a really strong sourdough smell to it, so that's why it looks that way. Not because I'm lazy and gross, I promise. So to start with, we put the hot water in the bowl, and then the yeast. And I don't always let my yeast bloom like you're supposed to, but with the pearled yeast you have to let it bloom. So I'm going to put the sugar, yeast, and hot water in the bowl, and I'm going to let it sit for 10 minutes. Okay, the yeast has been blooming for 10 minutes, and this is what it should look like. This not only lets you know that your yeast is alive and active, but also that it's ready to go. This pearl yeast, if I just mix it up like I would with regular yeast and don't let it bloom, it doesn't rise quite as well, so this just kind of gives it a head start. So that is a good sight right there. So I'm just going to add a little bit of flour. This is 3 cups of flour, but I'm going to put a little in. And you can use any utensil. This is a Danish dough hook. Get it stirred up a little bit. You can add all of it at once or little bits at once, doesn't really matter. So there's some more. Starting to thicken. I'll put the rest in. Okay. This is really hard to do with one hand. Okay, that's better. Okay, so you take your dough hook. I usually use it to scrape down flour and other bits off the side of the bowl. Now, every bread recipe you're ever going to read, oh, I forgot my splash of oil too. I don't always put oil in, sometimes I do. I don't know, it's just how I feel today. Every bread recipe you're ever going to read talks about kneading your dough forever. And I'm not a big fan of that because I think that makes your bread really dense and not as delicious. So even though this does not look like how you want your bread dough to look, I'm going to leave it like this for the first hour. And what happens in that first hour is that all the flour rehydrates, and when I pull it out, it's going to look totally different. So I use a covered batter bowl. So I just put the lid on, and then we'll do the next part here. I put this in my oven with the light on, not the heat, for 1 hour. Okay, the dough has been in the oven for an hour. So I'm just going to knead it into a ball here. And if you see, it looks completely different than when we put it in. It's totally hydrated and elasticy, which is what we want. I'm just going to scrape it away from the sides. And it's at this point that most bread recipes tell you to knead your dough for 8 minutes. I will never do that. I think it totally ruins your dough. This is the extent of the kneading I'm going to do. Now, it looks nice on the outside. It feels a little bit lumpy on the inside, but it's still hydrating as it goes the last hour, and all those lumps will come out. So I like to just put mine into a little ball, just like this, and then you put the lid back on for another hour. Okay, my dough has been in the oven for 40 minutes, and something I've been doing lately is taking it out at 40 minutes, leaving the timer running, turning my oven on to 400 degrees with the stone in it, and then shaping the bread and letting it rise for the last 20 minutes, or proof as it's called. Turn my oven on. The proofing is really important if you want your bread to turn out uniform. And I'm sprinkling flour on here because it's just a little too sticky. You see it's sticking to my fingers, and it really shouldn't be. I don't want too much flour, I don't want it to be too dry, but I also don't want it sticking to my fingers. So loosen it all around the bowl. Get as much off the sides as I can. I do like to leave some in there so that it can do its magic for the next loaf of bread. Alright, so I'll take it out. My bowl looks pretty good. Still a little sticky on the top. So I'm going to sprinkle just a little bit more flour on there so it doesn't stick to my counter. Now this is the important part. This is the shaping. And again, most bread recipes will have you knead for a whole bunch of minutes before you shape. I do not do that. I just take it out. See, I've got my bottom here. My bottom looks a little grosser than my top. And I'm just going to roll until it's in a loaf shape. And you got to put your seam right here. Put your seam at the bottom because it will, it'll all come together while it's rising. And even if your dough feels a little lumpy under your fingers, that's okay. Those don't come out, or they don't stay in, I should say, while it's baking. So that's my loaf form that I wanted to take. See if you can get the whole thing in there. Just going to sprinkle a little more flour on top. It's got 20 minutes that it's going to sit here and proof, and it will keep rising while it does that. And we'll come back and check in with it in 20 minutes. Okay, the bread has been proofing for 20 minutes. While it was proofing, I put it on my breadboard. Shut my dishwasher off. I put it on my breadboard because it's easier to get onto the stone with one hand, which I will be doing trying to hold my phone. Before I put it in the oven, I'm just going to make some slash marks across the top. And people have different patterns they make. It doesn't really matter. What does matter is that it helps to release the steam as it cooks. And then one other thing I do is it gets a little stuck to the board while it's proofing. So I'm just going to put some flour under it so that it doesn't stick when I put it into the oven. Okay, now to the oven we will go. And there's my oven. Just going to scoot it in there, and it's going to stay in the oven for 35 minutes. Okay, the bread has been in the oven for 35 minutes, and this is what it looks like. I'm going to slide my breadboard underneath it, grab it, and bring it over here. So you can see the final step, which is the buttering. And you can melt your butter and use a basting brush and be all fancy if you want to, but I don't do that because I'm lazy mostly. So I just brush some butter over the top of it, and then it is done. The most important thing, you're going to want to cut into it right now, and you cannot do that. You have to let it sit probably 40 minutes. Let it cool, because if you cut into it now, it's actually still cooking on the inside. And so if I cut into it, it would be gummy and kind of raw in the middle. So you have to leave it alone, let it sit. Don't let your husband get into it. Mine likes to do that. So just let it be for 40 minutes and then cut into it and enjoy.